Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
A very warm welcome, esteemed ladies and gentlemen, to our Mena-Watch YouTube channel. Today we have the honor of once again welcoming Thomas von der Osten-Sacken to our Mena-Watch discussion. Well, obviously, we'll be discussing the war in Iran and, yes, what the current status of this conflict actually is and what the future prospects appear to be, particularly with a special emphasis on the situation of the Kurds in both Iran and Iraq. But first, as a matter of courtesy, hello Thomas, thank you so much for making time for us again.
Hello, good day to you.
Indeed, we are now almost 2 weeks, so to speak, into this ongoing conflict. What's the current state of affairs? Is this war, from the perspective of the U.S. and Israel, unfolding as they might have had to envision it playing out? Have there been any major surprises that weren't anticipated? What's your take on the current situation?
Well, I think we really need to differentiate between the tactical and strategic levels here. Well, I am no military expert. I think that on the tactical level, that is concerning the military's targeted strikes, the elimination of missile positions belonging to the regime and so forth, at least both sides claim to be extraordinarily successful with what is now presumably over 10,000 airstrikes and rocket attacks have now taken place. However, on a strategic level, a pertinent question arises as to whether this war is truly as successful as portrayed, even though, from a strategic standpoint, there's an undeniable divergence between Israel's objectives, which predominantly revolve around neutralizing a significant existential threat without having a particular focus or emphasis on what exactly happens in the aftermath of these events. From the U.S. perspective, it's quite simply still not clear what the actual war objective is, the strategic war objective to be precise. And in the last few days, we've been hearing such a wide variety of different conflicting statements, many of which also contradict each other, that, quite a few question marks are certainly starting to pop up in our minds. And quite frankly, I believe there was a significant underestimation of just how well Iran had prepared for this war. Also, it truly wasn't anticipated that Iran would now be escalating this war, carrying it into a staggering 12 different countries, was it? From Turkey, Azerbaijan, all the Gulf states, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, just to name the most significant ones. And with that, it's now obviously pursuing a strategy that isn't primarily aimed at achieving a military victory, because Iran simply cannot win this war militarily. But it is quite clearly leaning into this entire traditional form of asymmetric warfare, where the primary objective is to significantly escalate the costs for the opposing side, making it incredibly burdensome for them. And you can also see that reflected in issues like missile defense, for example, which is quite clear. I mean, if you're firing $1 million Patriot missile at a 30,000 euro Shahed drone, that's going to become incredibly, incredibly expensive at some point in time, don't you think? And on the other hand, of course, the question now is, as it is in every war, what exactly will be the ultimate outcome? Is this the end? What's the way out of this? And if we consider the absolute worst-case scenario, that this Islamic Republic regime somehow manages to survive this conflict, even after suffering immense personnel losses, including their supreme leader, then the point has arrived where Iran actually just needs not to lose. We've now arrived at a juncture where Iran effectively just needs to avoid losing, wouldn't you agree? And that brings us to the famous words of Sun Tzu, the esteemed ancient Chinese military general who penned the seminal work, The Art of War. Since then, it's become quite clear. In an asymmetric war, the symmetrically warring side absolutely must emerge victorious. The opposing side simply needs not to lose. And at the exact moment Donald Trump speaks of victory, or even of unconditional surrender, He essentially gives Iran the gift, making it clear from this point forward that one side must achieve victory while the other side simply needs to avoid defeat. And if the side that only needs not to lose doesn't lose, then the other side hasn't won either.
As you already mentioned at the start, it's naturally the same old thing again. With Trump, everything really just depends on his mood and probably the time of day. Sometimes it's like this, sometimes it's different. So one day he's talking about unconditional surrender, and the next he's claiming, we've de facto already won this war, and we can bring it to an end soon. But I mean, for him to just stand there and declare, all right, we've won the war now, it just doesn't work that way.
No, because he has now effectively given Iran the hand to decide when the war is over, so we must now play out the absolute worst-case scenario. So the day after tomorrow, or a week from now, Trump declares, the war is finished, we have prevailed. Yet Iran continues its low-intensity asymmetrical warfare strategy. So, certain Shiite militias in Iraq continue to attack targets using drones. Infrastructure targets within the Gulf states continue to face attacks, you see. The Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, remains closed off. Well then, this war isn't over yet. This effectively means that with this declaration made by the U.S. military, Iran now has the power to decide if and when this war will truly end. And that's ultimately completely absurd, but that's the nature of asymmetric war. I believe Trump is making a grave error there, a type of mistake that the United States has regrettably committed quite frequently over the past few decades. Specifically, it's about their belief that with overwhelming military superiority, employing a shock and awe strategy, they can genuinely overcome and defeat any opponent. They truly should have learned from their experiences in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the fight against ISIS, among others, that modern warfare, particularly these asymmetric conflicts, operates on a fundamentally different logic which they seem to have missed. However, that doesn't seem to be the case once more, despite the most significant lesson from the past 20 years truly being Afghanistan, where the Taliban's continued resistance and refusal to lose over 2 decades ultimately resulted in them emerging as the discernible victors. Thus, it's now widely understood that asymmetrical wars can indeed have such fatally disastrous consequences, like the war in Afghanistan.
And then, in this particular instance, we also have the additional problem, as you've already pointed out, that it's not at all clear what the actual concrete objective is here. Or completely different goals are stated, and every introductory book on military strategy says, when you wage war, you first need to be clear about the strategic objective, and second, you must clarify the means by which you will achieve it. And both of these, at least concerning Trump, I'd make a clear distinction between the US military and Trump here, but as far as Trump is concerned, it's absolutely and entirely unclear, and it also results in a complete lack of clarity as to what means he is currently using to pursue which of his 5 different objectives.
Yes, I mean, a military has to be able to operate tactically, and it truly requires a political objective to guide it. And that political objective doesn't seem to exist at the moment. We can always hold on to the belief that this is all just some elaborate 5-dimensional chess game where you say nothing or say something different every day to completely confuse the enemy. But honestly, I don't quite get that impression from the appearances of this current US administration. I mean, from day one. And from the very tendency of Trump's address on Truth Social, that 8-minute video speech, it was already going in the direction that the system of the Islamic Republic, that regime, must be overthrown. Right? I think that went hand in hand with the strong hope that this decapitation strike they executed on the very first day, which eliminated Ayatollah Khamenei and numerous other high-ranking regime officials, would create such an immense shockwave throughout Iran that the conflict could be brought to a swift conclusion, ending the war very, very quickly. That was, however, an egregious miscalculation regarding the Islamic Republic system, where the Revolutionary Guards now wield a far greater influence and where a significant portion of the repressive apparatus has been decentralized. And then somehow everyone was astonished. Firstly, that Iran had expanded this war across the entire region, and secondly, that quite obviously, things in Iran just carried on for the time being. So, and coupled with that is this completely misguided notion, in my opinion, that much like in Venezuela or Iran, you can simply replace someone at the top and then you'll magically have some kind of pro-American friendly regime that you can then effectively collaborate with in the future. And the week that followed was characterized by the fact that literally every 24 hours, something new was being ventilated or floated around. So one moment, it was about how Iran would have invaded the entire Middle East in 2 weeks. Then it was about shutting down the long-range missile programs and wanting to have a say in determining who the new leader of Iran would be. It even went as far as suddenly floating the idea of supporting Iranian Kurds as ground troops. Then it was back to, no, we definitely don't want any any Kurdish troops. And at the very same time, it's abundantly clear the global economy, the oil supply, and so on and so forth are consequences that quite obviously nobody could have anticipated. And of course, this has a profound impact, not only for us who are observing these events unfold, but even more so for the various actors on the ground who are directly involved and affected by the situation. Because if I'm an Iranian opposition member, or a Kurdish party, or a Baluch, etc., I'm also asking myself, what is this war actually leading to right now? Is it truly worth risking everything right now against such an extremely brutal, repressive regime, especially when I know it will retaliate massively and violently? And just the day before yesterday, the Tehran police chief explicitly stated, anyone who takes to the streets will be shot. So, should I really risk my life just so that, in the end, some superficial change is made at the very top of the Islamic Republic, and I'm ultimately the one who has to pay the ultimate price? And this complete absence of any strategic planning has, of course, this planning, of course, now also has significant repercussions for all those who had optimistically hoped that this second war against the Islamic Republic within a mere 6 months would indeed be the decisive conflict that would finally bring this regime to its much anticipated end.
Adding to that, it has been less than 3 months since the U.S. essentially abandoned its closest allies in Syria, specifically the Kurds, more or less overnight. This abrupt shift left many wondering about their true loyalties and commitments in the region. I mean, everyone in that region definitely took note of it, and it really speaks volumes about the trust, or perhaps the mistrust, that people there understandably harbor towards the Americans in many places. Well, while we're on this subject, let's turn our attention to the Kurds. You brought that up. There's basically new and different reports coming out on that every single day. 1 minute they say the U.S. wants to arm the Kurds so they can go in and liberate part of the country from the regime, so to speak. Then from Trump's side, it's, no, he doesn't think it's a good idea after all. What exactly can you tell us about that? What specific preparations, discussions, or plans were actually in place? So, what exactly is the stance of the Kurdish parties, specifically the Iranian Kurdish parties who are predominantly based in northern Iraq? What are their thoughts on this entire situation?
Indeed, I actually put together a little piece about this for you last week because beginning last Monday, it suddenly exploded as a major topic in the global media. And of course, just to really emphasize this point again, at the moment, among the Iranian Kurdish parties, as with the entire Iranian opposition, there is a great, great hope that this hated regime will finally be overthrown and brought to an end. This is what people have been working towards for decades, and now there's an immense, fervent hope that it will finally come to pass. In northern Iraq, or more precisely, in Iraqi Kurdistan, the various different Iranian Kurdish parties, the most important of which, to name them again, are the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, which dates back to the 40s, and the PJAK, which is close to the PKK. Various leftist Kamalas, primarily those with socialist or communist leanings, had some time ago already formed both a political and a military alliance, effectively pooling their resources and strengthening their combined efforts. Before that, they were all somewhat at odds and had already been preparing for months. Their plan was that if the situation on the Iranian Kurdish side permitted it and massive protests and uprisings broke out, they would cross over with the few thousand armed forces they have, and that's precisely what they intended to do. This is again in the form of asymmetrical warfare, with the aim of taking over territories as much as possible, both in the short and long term, to establish something similar to the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, a federal system which is one of the central demands of all non-Persian opposition groups in Iran. Last week, when this information was leaked, the fact that the CIA was arming these groups, making them resemble some mercenary force straight out of a bad Cold War film or something, it naturally had enormously counterproductive effects. Firstly, the Kurdish regional government in Iraq came under immense pressure from Iran. And also from Baghdad saying, "Why are you doing this? Stop it." And secondly, the pressing question truly emerged, are we now just meant to be sacrificed here? So perhaps we should try to divert our attention a little bit from this theater of war right now. Why is this being publicly discussed and debated in the media? And following the events of last week, we've noted that all the more recent statements from these Iranian Kurdish parties have been exceptionally reserved. So, for now, we don't want to do anything. We're waiting to see how the situation develops. We're hoping that the regime is so severely weakened that it genuinely sparks civil uprisings on the Iranian side. And then we'll reevaluate the situation completely. We are not part of this war. We are not a belligerent party. So, these are the statements from the last 3 or 4 days, which sound quite different from what we heard just 10 days ago. And that, of course, is largely attributable to the fact that Turkey, Iran, and Iraq have now reacted quite forcefully and very massively to this particular report. That none of them, of course, want the war in Iraq, and we mustn't forget, Iraq is a theater of war to have escalated dramatically over the past few weeks, putting everyone in a very precarious position. So, there are massive and impending attacks on targets within Iraqi Kurdistan, targeting not only the party strongholds of the Iranian Kurdish factions, but also hotels and even American installations. Meanwhile, in retaliation, Americans and Israelis are bombing Shiite militias allied with Iran, targeting areas such as Kirkuk, Mosul, and southern Iraq. So, currently, a low-intensity conflict is unfolding in Iraq, and everyone fears it could escalate uncontrollably, potentially igniting a new civil war. And within that context, so the initial response now is basically to say, we'll just wait and see. We're going to wait and see what unfolds in Iran, and we'll also observe what the actual objective of the US is in this war. Meanwhile, and I believe this is still quite important to be aware of, one can already see that on the Iranian Kurdish side, or as the Iranian Kurds themselves would say, in Rojalat, also known as East Kurdistan, police stations, border outposts, Basiji militias, and revolutionary guards are being bombed far more systematically than in other areas of Iran. So the bombardment in Iranian Kurdistan is harsher than in other parts of Iran. The presumption is that the Israeli Air Force is primarily paving the way there, preparing the ground so that later on it will lead to uprisings, mass protests, and so forth, thereby fostering civil unrest. Which is what the Kurdish parties are also saying now. We are preparing for a civilian uprising on the Iranian Kurdish side. The people are essentially ready. However, as is typical across all parts of Iran, this is currently incredibly challenging due to a complete internet blackout. And we know that's also a weapon in asymmetric warfare against your own population, right? We've learned over the last 2 decades that, without the internet, trying to organize civil resistance, protests, or similar movements in 2026 would be incredibly difficult, if not entirely impossible, even if one wished to.
One should perhaps add that the situation in, particularly the predominantly Kurdish regions of Iran, is indeed somewhat, if not entirely different from that in the rest of the country. insofar as that has consistently been a central focus of the regime's repressive tactics, you see. So whenever something happened, they cracked down particularly hard there, and the whole region has de facto been under Revolutionary Guard occupation for the past few years. Does that have to do with the fact that, as you say, the Israelis in particular are carrying out more airstrikes there?
Well, the question, it seems, is that what you're saying, what you hear, and you hear relatively little because of the internet blackout, it could also be the Americans. In any case, it's quite evident that places like border stations bordering Iraqi Kurdistan were bombed, along with Basij and police stations within cities such as Sanandaj, Marivan, and others. And that only truly makes sense if you're trying, so to speak, to prepare something completely out of thin air, wouldn't you agree? So, now it is also clearly understood that should any armed actions ever take place, whether that be within Iranian Kurdistan or in other regions of Iran, where an armed opposition still maintains a presence, like Baluchistan or certain parts of Khuzestan where the Arab-populated territories are located, densely populated areas, they really have only a slim chance of success if there's a no-fly zone in effect, and they also have the support of an air force. We know this from all these asymmetric conflicts and also from being right there on the ground, don't we? The reason why the Kurdish SDF or the Kurdish militias in Syria were relatively successful over the years is because they had the Americans as their air force. Without an air force, you're utterly lost. It appears these ideas and plans somehow do exist. If they'll be implemented is totally unclear, you know. But that, for example, is now a very clear demand from Iranian Kurdish parties. So, we want a no-fly zone established over the western part of Iran, ensuring that if any uprisings or conflicts break out, the opposition forces won't be able to just bombard everything with helicopters or an air force, as has happened in so many other unfortunate situations, leaving the people with absolutely no chance to defend themselves. That's clear. Furthermore, it's evident that if any organized protests or uprisings, however you wish to term them, accompanied by armed escorts, were to occur anywhere in Iran in the near future, it would exclusively be within these non-Persian border regions. This is due to a well-established history and tradition of such activities in those specific areas. That there are political groups, factions that still exist, and they possess a small arsenal of light weaponry, you know, that's clearly Kurdistan and that's Baluchistan. But of course the Iranians are also very afraid of that now. Last week they reacted with extreme harshness, stating, any form of separatism will be brutally suppressed by us. In their terminology, separatism refers to the non-Persian opposition groups, you understand. So, Tehran is genuinely fearful of this. Tehran is apprehensive that uprisings might erupt along the periphery and that these insurrections could be supported by specific armed factions. These groups could then seize control, re-equip themselves by taking over police stations and similar facilities, and then encircle at the core of Iran, along its periphery, something of that nature unfolds.
But what about that? You just spoke of the regime, but this isn't only a phenomenon restricted to the regime, it's also quite prevalent within the Iranian opposition. We ourselves experience this firsthand. Whenever we have conversations with you or when we receive reports concerning the situation in the Kurdish part of Iran, we can always expect to be inundated with more or less angry emails from Iranian monarchists, accusing us of promoting Kurdish separatism, questioning our reasons, and claiming we support terrorism and the like. So this fear of supposed Kurdish separatism is by no means limited to just the regime.
No, that's a huge problem for the entire Iranian opposition. So Thus, a significant issue for the Iranian opposition is that, unlike the Iraqi opposition in 2003, for instance, it hasn't managed to agree upon any foundational principles, a few fundamental tenets, you see. Therefore, in 2003, it was unequivocally clear to all Iraqi opposition parties there would be a federal system established and self-governance for the Kurds within Iraqi Kurdistan. Nobody questioned that, and that's why the Iraqi Kurds were such a crucial factor in the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. Without their involvement, it probably never would have happened this way. And now we're observing within the very, very fragmented Iranian opposition intense debates surrounding this very question. What truly lies ahead for the 40 to 45% of non-Persian nationalities in Iran? The most intense disputes are taking place, which are, of course, highly counterproductive. Moreover, the Shah's son also recently addressed the issue of separatism, although he then somewhat backtracked just to make it absolutely clear that he doesn't really have anything, so to speak, against those he refers to as minorities. And that represents an extremely significant problem, because at present, a reliable point of contact on the Iranian side for the period after a potential collapse of the regime is simply missing. On one side, you have the monarchists with the Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi. Then there's the People's Mujahideen. The Republican Party in the U.S. is already entirely divided on this issue. One faction has supported the monarchists, while the other faction has been supporting the People's Mujahideen for quite a long time. They absolutely despise each other like the plague. Then the big question arises, where do we stand on the Kurdish opposition parties? How do we stand on the Baloch and the Arabs in Khuzestan? There's also still the question of Azerbaijan in the north, right? So, that's truly everyone's greatest fear, isn't it? That there isn't a truly unified or even semi-unified Iranian opposition. And there's no one available who, in a crunch, possesses sufficient armed forces to maintain peace and order should this regime actually collapse. That's a major concern in Iran. It could lead to civil war, chaos, and so on in Iran. Because we mustn't forget this regime still has its supporters. The ratio might be about 70-30 between people who hope it falls and people who would defend it to the very end, and those who would defend it, the ones who truly have a lot at stake, are precisely those who possess the weaponry. Which is why it's completely absurd when someone like Trump calls on the Revolutionary Guards to surrender their weapons and capitulate. You have to ask to whom? To their colleague? Who? I mean, that's exactly the problem. There is absolutely no scenario envisioning what would actually happen if the security situation in Iran continues to deteriorate further, if widespread unorganized protests erupt, if young people were to storm police stations and arm themselves, and then, on the other side, they find themselves confronting Basij militiamen devoted to defending the regime. How do the Revolutionary Guards react who are now highly decentralized? These are all scenarios that one should have given some thought to in advance, especially when it comes to strategic planning. And it seems that there's very, very little of that available.
Yes, it's always quite astonishing to witness the sheer incompetence you encounter in certain places, especially where you would absolutely not expect to find it. Let's get back to the fundamental question. David Petraeus, the well-known U.S. general, summed up the problem, or the core issue, of the Iraq war with a short phrase, "How will this end? Tell me how this ends." What's the answer to that?
I don't know. I don't think anyone knows at the moment, you know. We can really only try now that this war has started, and with all of its, extremely negative consequences for many, many people in the region. We must not forget that. This is in Iran, as well as in Lebanon, in Israel, and in the Gulf states, for so many people, the last few weeks have been an absolute horror. People are dying here. So this isn't simply something we can just, dismiss. My colleagues in Iraqi Kurdistan are preparing for a massive wave of refugees from Iran if this whole situation goes south. That's also something that could very well happen. So, we don't know how it will end. And we can't decide it either. We weren't asked, and we're not being asked now. One can only really say this. For the people of Iran, the vast majority of whom genuinely and ardently desire for this current regime to finally come to an end, one can only truly hope that this entire situation culminates with the complete downfall of this oppressive regime, which doesn't mean that Swiss-like conditions will prevail in Iran. Instead, it will become very, very unpleasant, bloody, and so on, just like in all the other countries in the region, I assume. But that's just how it is, unfortunately. One can truly hope that the significant threat that has consistently originated from this Islamic Republic of Iran over the past several decades, a threat keenly felt by Israel, by all the neighboring countries it has relentlessly destabilized, and which is responsible for a substantial portion of the truly dire situation in the Middle East, is over. That it's finally over, that it becomes a thing of the past. And the absolute worst outcome would be if a now weakened Islamic Republic manages to survive this ordeal and then brazenly present itself as the triumphant victor. We held our ground. We truly stood up to both the United States and Israel, and we were unwavering. This we also achieved with the messianic Islamist ideology that we possess and uphold. God, so to speak, was also on our side, and now we're just going to keep going. That is the absolute worst-case scenario. And between this best imaginable outcome and the worst possible scenario, there's now a very broad spectrum of things that could potentially unfold.
One problem you naturally face when assessing the whole situation from an external perspective is that it's incredibly difficult to acquire genuinely reliable or, to receive more accurate information regarding what's currently occurring within Iran itself. So what you read is that many people, as you say, are saying, yes, the worst thing, yes, the bombs are bad, but first they're hitting the right people, and second, the worst thing would be if this just ended now and the regime stayed in power. But the question is, how can the regime fall? Are there any reports you're aware of that people often discuss concerning cracks or fractures within the regime, which might somehow be perceptible or evident?
Well, the Israelis did report this morning, though one doesn't really know if it's biased reporting or factual, that there are, so to speak, the first significant fractures beginning to appear within their security apparatus, But one must never forget with Iran that it's not simply a purely totalitarian Arab dictatorship, where, in the end, when it finally starts to crumble, it will just completely crumble and fall apart. Just like we observed in Syria in 2024, at a certain stage after al-Shahra's HTS advanced, it became evident that nobody was fighting in Damascus any longer. There, people go home, take off their uniforms, and then they flee. Well, if there's nothing left, then it just collapses at some point. Iran is structured differently. It's like an onion system with revolutionary guards, Basij, decentralized, where the ultimately state institutions are very, very weakened. The military doesn't play a big role. The police don't play a big role. This is very different from many other countries. And that's why it's so incredibly difficult to envision scenarios where someone would unexpectedly switch sides or defect. So, following the model of the Free Syrian Army in 2011-2012, where officers simply switched sides, that's not quite the case here, because the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij are, on the one hand, deeply ideological groups, you see. And on the other hand, they control 60% of the Iranian economy. So, they have an incredible amount to lose and are enormously hated by the population. And they'll likely endeavor to maintain a completely unified front, keeping their ranks tightly closed for the foreseeable future, as long as they possibly can. Quite simply because at the moment, as we discussed right at the very outset, from the perspective of an Iranian Revolutionary Guard or a supporter of the regime, there actually exists a genuine possibility of not losing this war and being able to persist. And as long as there remains a possibility of avoiding defeat in this war, which under an asymmetric logic translates to vanquishing both the great and lesser Satans, there are few compelling motives to defect or turn against a fellow member from a differing faction at this time. And that, I believe, is the significant issue. At the moment, large protests organized by unarmed civilians would undoubtedly culminate in bloody massacres and furthermore could not even be orchestrated in the first place without the internet.
And with the revolutionary guards, there's another thing. The idea of them just dropping their weapons is totally surreal. I mean, these are people who just massacred tens of thousands of Iranians a few weeks ago, and now they're supposed to suddenly say, oh, it was nothing, we'll go home now. So that's not a serious prospect. The amazing thing is always...
To conclude, what's so tragic about all of this is perhaps this. The failure in Afghanistan and ultimately the Gaza war are indeed two significant examples that vividly demonstrate how Islamist actors can continue to survive and even thrive. So, Hamas remains in Gaza, maintaining control over significant portions of it, and there's no indication whatsoever that they will be disarmed or indeed ultimately defeated in either the mid- or long-term future. And the Taliban emerged victorious in Afghanistan after 2 decades. So these are indeed two striking examples illustrating that if one is willing to sacrifice for it, I don't know how many people and the economic future and all sorts of other things one does not lose, therefore victory is achievable. That is, so to speak, the kind of hope that these individuals within the Iranian regime are holding on to right now. And they meticulously observe, just as we do, what pronouncements and the like are emerging from the United States. They can simply and significantly drive up the economic price. We see that everywhere, at every gas station right now. So they're counting on the fact that they will survive this.
Especially since this is also, just to briefly conclude, a point that is becoming increasingly clear. Trump does not appear to be willing to pay the full economic price that would truly be necessary to ultimately win this war. So he could, of course, further weaken the regime by, for instance, seizing Karg Island, upon which the Iranian oil economy quite naturally continues to depend heavily, even to this very day. That would, of course, cause oil prices to skyrocket, and Trump just doesn't appear to be prepared to take that action.
At least that is certainly the strong impression it creates, right? Because we can't forget, this war is quite unpopular in the U.S. It's unprecedented for the U.S. to wage war with the majority of the population against it. So if you compare it to the support at the beginning of the Iraq war or something, you have to remember, this war is, we don't need to discuss whether it's illegal under international law or not. That's a relatively uninteresting discussion, but this war is unconstitutional according to the U.S. Constitution. So Congress did not authorize this war, nor was it consulted. And some of his MAGA guys and girls elected and supported him because he had said no more wars in the Middle East. And now this is truly one of the biggest conflicts in a very, very long time. So on the one hand, he is under tremendous pressure. On the other hand, we must also seriously consider the fact that, of course, we also notice, and maybe this is a final point, this problem. Israel now quite obviously has an undeniable and significant interest in disarming this regime in Iran for as long and as sustainably as possible wherever and whenever it can, given its strategic imperatives. With the perspective that, ideally, this regime, the system of the Islamic Republic, will also fall. Right? So, the immediate consequences for Israel aren't so important or interesting, though. This implies that the military in Israel, I believe, dictates the overall direction. So, when its objectives have been accomplished, and if that requires a week, then a week it shall be. If it takes another 2 weeks, it takes another 2 weeks, and the absolute majority of the Israeli population supports it. This means the Israeli government isn't under any pressure from below. It's completely different in the US. So the United States' objective is much more ambiguous than Israel's goal. Now, of course, the big question is, when will these two sides inevitably collide? So, essentially, when will the interests of the United States clash with those of Israel? And if this ongoing war should go wrong, or if the collateral damage and costs continue to escalate, I fear, and this is already becoming apparent in the USA, then Israel will inevitably be made the scapegoat. So right now, we're seeing this from that very strong anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist MAGA corner, Tucker Carlson and that crowd. And also from the Democratic Socialist corner, they're asking, why are we fighting a war for Israel here? you know? And with that, the scapegoat is effectively predetermined, which is an argument we are already quite clearly seeing emerging in Europe, isn't it? So, if the United States is not able to articulate a clear strategic objective in the immediate future, what also constitutes American interests, so to speak, what America's stake is in this war, I fear that this pursuit of scapegoats will intensify and become more prevalent and eventually even more dominant. And then Israel finds itself confronting the problem that, and once again, this is asymmetric warfare, it may well be able to demonstrate military success, yet politically it will emerge as the absolute loser.
Yes, I would say, well, on that rather bleak note, and with this not very promising outlook, I'd like to extend my thanks for today. I'm quite certain we'll soon have another opportunity to discuss this matter in the very near future. This topic will certainly be with us for a while, so first of all, thank you very much, Thomas, for taking the time.
My pleasure.
And to you, our dear viewers, as always at the end of our discussions, a request. If you enjoyed the conversation, if you're interested in our work, then please subscribe to our channel, comment on our videos, or support us in other ways. With that, thank you for today. We'll see you again soon. Goodbye.
Okay.
Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.